Well, welcome to our third lesson on the book of Esther. This is the third actual lesson that we are embarking to understand the details of this incredible book that God has placed in His Word for us to read and to hear from Him. But the first thing we notice when we look into this book of Esther is that the name of God is not mentioned at all. God seems to be assumed in the details that are taking place in this book. However, the book seems to be a puzzle that's full of drama. It's almost like reading a Hollywood script. This narrative is placed here to point us to God and to show us that God orchestrates the details of our lives. Yes, God is seemingly silent in the events of this book, but we know He is there orchestrating, crafting, and carefully mending and fitting the pieces together in the background. Now, a little bit of some historical background, a review of what we already covered. We do know that in 930 BC, the Hebrews went into a civil war and the nation breaks up into two. There was the northern kingdom, also known as Israel, and the southern kingdom, known as the kingdom of Judah. But in 586 BC, the southern kingdom, which was also known Judah, was taken into captivity by Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar. But about 100 years later, in 485 BC, the Babylonian kingdom lost the war to a new political player, the Persians. It is here that we find a new king taking the lead. His name is King Xerxes, the son of King Darius the Great and Atossa, the daughter of Cyrus. King Cyrus, or Ahasuerus, as his Hebrew name is known, was Darius's preferred heir to the throne instead of his older brother Artabazanes, who was the rightful heir to the throne, but Darius preferred Xerxes to take the lead. Now, Xerxes was later assassinated by one of his advisors, and Cyrus reigned in Persia for about 21 years. And by the time Queen Esther or Esther comes to the scene, Xerxes is in his third year of leadership. Josephus, the historian, records that Xerxes was a very successful and wealthy king. King Xerxes seems to be a prideful wimp who had no backbone. Everything goes with this particular king. He seems to be always tipsy and an accomplished drunk for sure. History records that Xerxes was also a ruthless king and he's known for his harsh punishments. He's also known as a womanizer and a king who drained the treasury of the Persian Empire with his lavish lifestyle and entertainment. Catch Xerxes in the right mood, and you can be guaranteed that your wish will be fulfilled. That's the kind of king he was. And one of his officials by the name of Haman knew that for sure. So Xerxes was married to a queen by the name of Vashti. The Midrash conveys that Vashti was an orphaned daughter of Belshazzar and the great granddaughter of King Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed the first temple in Jerusalem in 586 BC. Queen Vashti is interesting. She is bold and strong-willed, but because of her strong personality and her boldness, she is shoved aside so that Queen Esther may come to power. Our boldness, even though good in itself, works in the favor of another, in the favor of Esther. And then we find Mordecai, who is the cousin of Esther and the adoptive parent of Esther. Mordecai was a descendant of the Jews who had come into captivity in Persia, but never returned under Ezra or Zerubbabel. So Mordecai is successful and has a secure job with the government at Susa, and he is living in the palace. He knows that his people are supposed to be separate and are called to be different, but that fact sits in the back of his mind. He lets it simmer for a while. He says, let's live and make money for now. That seems to be his philosophy. We shall follow the Torah and the laws of God and of Moses, but not now, just a little bit later. Mordecai is fully assimilated into the Persian culture, and he's at least 3 generations removed from his people, and he even has a Persian name. He's adopted a name that will not be easily known, or a name that covers his heritage. Mordecai is knows the laws of the Lord, and he knows that the Lord has commended his people and given them the law in Dethroning that says, when you come to the land which the Lord gives you, you shall not be like the people of that land. You shall be different and holy, for I am a God who is holy. Mordecai had placed that command in the back of his mind. His Hebrew name was kind of forgotten by now, and he could almost make a case to excuse his behavior, his actions, and his lifestyle. He's living the high life in Persia. All is cozy, and he will not reveal who he is. He will not reveal his family background or his heritage to anyone. He will keep it hush hush. He and his cousin Esther have deliberately chosen to hide their identity. But a crisis is coming that will force them to be who they are, or they will perish. Mordecai is a faithful man to his God, and he takes care of Esther. We also find another character in this book known as Haman. Haman was a wealthy and a very influential person and a powerful person, a court official in the palace at Susa. He was second in command. Haman is ugly in his character. He is power hungry and does not like Mordecai at all. He's a hateful person, and above all, he's anti-Semitic. Haman does not like Mordecai at all. He's like Hitler of the day. He's feared and hated person. He's a hater of foreigners and especially Jews. That is not cool, but that is the character of Haman. You can almost hear him say this word to the king, found in Esther chapter 3, verses 8 and 9, when he says, then Haman said to King Xerxes, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other person or people in this land, and they do not keep the king's laws, he says. So that it's not to the king's profit to tolerate this kind of people. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let it be decreed that this kind of people be destroyed, and I will even pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have the charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries. Here, he is willing to give up 3/4 of his salary in a year in bribing the king to see that this act is executed. Then we find Esther, who is the lady who is the star of this story, of this book. Her name actually means star. Esther is young and beautiful, both outside and inside. She's exceptional. She's the woman that every man desires to find. Esther has been plagued by a few incidents, however, one of which is she has no parents. She's an orphan. She's an orphaned girl who works in the fields. but she is unique and humble, a girl who has nothing to prove. She's basking confidently in her beauty and doesn't even know how beautiful she is. She doesn't know that she got it. She's a quiet soul that God is going to use to save her whole nation. Now the king decides to show off his wealth and his power. And we see this in the book. So he gets his pride on and decides to show off his wealth to the leaders of the day and to his officials of his 127 provinces that stretch from India and Pakistan all the way to Ethiopia, or to the Sudan and then to Ethiopia's. Indeed, Max Lucado says there is a Mardi Gras of drinking and eating in the palace. End of quote. Xerxes is powerful and wealthy to throw a party, a feasting party that lasted for 6 months, a whole 180 days. Xerxes wants to impress his officials and to win their favor in waging war against Alexander and the Greeks. So after the 6 months of feasting and dancing and celebrating to excess and dancing and all that goes with parties, Xerxes goes ahead to throw another additional party that was going to last for another entire 7 days. Max Lucado again writes, when the ruler showed off his incompetence, his incompetence showed up. I quote that again. When the ruler showed off, his incompetence showed up. End of quote. Well, it is during this time that stuff begins to happen. The drama gets juicier. The king commands the wine to just flow and let everyone decide for themselves when enough is enough. You got to realize that during those days, no one drank in the presence of a king without his permission. But here, King Xerxes now lifts this rule to show off his acquisition of wealth and his goodness. It's during this time when the king is high in spirits that he decides to call to make a decision. Basically, when he is all drunk and completely imbibed, when things seems to just be going right, he sees it best to invite his beautiful wife, whose name means the desired one, to show up wearing nothing but a crown, as historians tell us. The Bible says she was beautiful to look at. Queen Vashti was gifted with beauty. According to Midrash, or the Midrash, an ancient commentary on Esther, Xerxes wanted his queen to show at the party wearing nothing but the crown, and to parade herself before the king and his list of who was who at that particular 7-day period. He's willing to display his wife to his cronies in the most embarrassing way. Things are getting out of control here. Verse 9 says that while the dancing and the drinking is going on at Xerxes' quarters, Vashti is also throwing a party for the ladies. Maybe the ladies who had come with their with the governors of the 127 provinces. She's also entertaining the ladies as well. A conflict is going to happen here. As the Talmud says, quote, Vashti refuses to show up wearing nothing but a crown. Well, the Talmud also seems to suggest that Vashti wanted to humiliate Xerxes in the presence of his guests. Vashti knew that Xerxes was a stable boy of her father, King Nebuchadnezzar. There seems to have been some unresolved issues between Xerxes and his queen, but that's a story for another day. But here is what we need to pose and say. Queen Vashti's refusal to show up and to show out may have been grounded in moral and personal reasons, but she definitely knew that the king had issued a command, and she also knew the consequences of her decision. Queen Vashti knew that her life was in the balance, but again, she was the most beautiful woman in Persia. Also, Vashti seems to know that the king is a drunk, and his call would amount to nothing but an embarrassment. Maybe we can say for Queen Vashti, she knew that once bitten, twice shy. We can also speculate from the text, since these details are obviously omitted, that Queen Vashti, with all of her independence and bestowed queenly powers, seems to have been prepared to figuratively dethrone our billionaire king after 6 months of drinking and partying and embarrassment at the palace. Vashti seems to have forgotten that she was only a trophy wife, a beautiful woman who happened to be the queen amongst the concubines. Queen Vashti must have forgotten that her powers were temporal and could be taken away from her in a flash of a second. Vashti, the strong-headed and maybe the most reasonable person in Xerxes' party at this time, decides not to show up and to dance her naked self before the drunken punks. She must have said to herself, I will not embarrass myself by entertaining you and your drunk cronies, king. The servants of Xerxes persuade her, but she is determined. They therefore are forced to take back the message to the king. Quote, O king of Persia, Vashti, your wife, your crown jewel, has refused to come to appear before you, king. End of quote. This message, of course, shocks not only the king, but his guests from the 127 provinces and his servants. The guests would probably be heard saying, you mean in this land women can blatantly refuse to appear before the king? This is a shocker to the heads of the 127 provinces and the leaders of Persia at the palace in Susa. But guess who is more shocked? Xerxes himself. He is taken back by Vashti's decision of disobedience, especially in the presence of a people he wants to impress. The king had motives and a reason for a 6 month party, I believe. His pride as a Middle Eastern male macho man is shaken to the core. What is he to do? Vashti seems to have hit Xerxes where it hurt the most, and she knew it. He almost gets drunk and quickly sober out of this response, and therefore he burns with incredible anger. He says to himself, what? She refuses to come? Who is she amongst the women of Persia? How will she defy me and rebel against the most powerful person in this world? Well, the drunk king, who is definitely seems to lack in wisdom, then asks his drunken friends with pride oozing from his mouth, what shall I do with this queen of mine? Even better, what does the law say about this kind of feminine disobedience? Well, Vashti also knew the consequences of her refusal to appear before the king were serious. Defiant Vashti knew she was going to face the music, and it seems that she was prepared to tangle with her husband. She took the risk. Now, with the king's pride and show off lead to his destruction, will he have mercy on his most beautiful wife in Persia? Will Vashti's disobedience lead to a dismissal as the queen of Persia? What will happen? The question we also need to ask ourselves, is God in control in the midst of this chaos? Where is God's providence in this party that is full of debauchery and disobedience and pride? Well, maybe we need to understand who God is before we can answer that question. Surely, how could God be working in the background? How is God setting the background to rescue a remnant of Jews in Persia? How will Vashti's honor and reservation of her dignity not to dance naked before her king and husband going to work out for her? How will Vashti's chastity be rewarded? How is Vashti's doing the right thing or the right moral thing going to be rewarded? Will the king have mercy on Vashti for preserving her dignity and at the same time the dignity of her drunk husband before his friends? How will the king's anger affect Vashti's future at the palace? She made the king look like he was not king at all by her disobedience. What will the advisors instruct the king when he inquires of them? Who is going to replace Vashti if that's going to happen? All these questions must have been running through the minds of the many people who are there. But what about our disobedience to the known laws of the land? What is going to happen when there seems to be nothing but darkness and pure hopelessness? It just doesn't seem to fit. Well, chapter 2 sets the stage for the world's most largest and most celebrated beauty pageant in Persia. For thousands of virgins, girls from the 127 provinces will be pulled away from their families to come to Susa to be the property of the king. These virgins will never be married again. They'll never see their parents again, but will wait to be called by the king at his will. And for many of them, their future will be destroyed and ended. They will die as concubines of the king. Well, here's the interesting part, because out of this harem of virgins, Esther finds a way to the palace. Mordecai takes the risk and places his cousin in the line of virgins who will go to entertain the king day and night. Esther's day will come, and the king falls in love with Esther. This was the idea that came out of the king's advisors who were qualified in the matters of the law. They were the king's legal advisors, and their advice was to expel Queen Vashti and make her never to appear before the king again. I also think that this was out of their insecurity of these advisors, and Memucan in particular, who is one of the advisors, he tells the king that a law has to be written in permanent ink in Persia and in the land of Media, a law that cannot be repealed. Memucan, one of the king's advisors, suggests that this law has to be written in a way that it cannot be changed, and to be specific, Queen Vashti is never to enter the presence of King Xerxes again. These drunken fellows suggest that another woman who is better than Vashti has to be found, and she has to be a replacement for Vashti. Here is where God's providence comes in for the orphaned girl, Hadassah or Esther. This poor Jewish girl is being prepared behind the scenes to take the place of Queen Vashti. These foolish advisors think that they are serving the king and themselves by their decision, but God has a different plan. The decree will not help the king save his face because he's still going to look like a fool. The king of drunkenness agrees to Memucan's idea and writes a decree to have Queen Vashti dethroned. Here is the spoiler alert. The king in chapter 2 later seems to regret his decision, for in verse 1 it states, after these things, when the anger of the king had been had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The king, in his years of loneliness, still remembered his queen, but the law had been written and passed. But God, again, in his providence, in his divine providence, is working out the details to save his people and to raise an orphaned girl to be queen. Amazing. Do we see God in this picture? Is God present and in charge of the little and the minutest details of our lives? How will these broken pieces make a beautiful mosaic of the characters in the palace? Is God in control in Esther's history? And is God even present in chapter 1? Here is where we shall pick up in lesson number 4 next week. Don't miss as we continue to explore this intriguing story of God's providence, a story where we see a very dynamic woman being raised from nothing to replace a defiant queen, Queen Vashti, and she ends up sitting on the throne. Join us next week as we continue with our amazing story, a study in the book of Esther. God bless you.